The fluorescent lights of Riverside Mall hummed overhead, casting their pale glow across the food court where Nick Moore stood in line at the burger counter, his 7-year-old daughter Emma tugging at his grease-stained work shirt. He was 41 years old, a mechanic at Brennan's Auto Repair on the east side of town, and he had promised his daughter lunch at the mall because it was Saturday, and Saturdays belonged to her. His hands were rough, calloused from years of work, and there was still a faint trace of motor oil beneath his fingernails that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. He wore faded jeans and work boots that had seen better days, and his truck in the parking lot was a 2004 Ford F-150 with rust creeping along the wheel wells and a tailpipe held together with wire and determination. None of that mattered to Emma. To her, he was just Dad, and Dad had promised chicken nuggets. The food court buzzed with the particular chaos of a Saturday afternoon. Families clustered around tables littered with trays and napkins. Teenagers moved in packs, their laughter sharp and careless. The smell of fried food and cinnamon rolls and cheap pizza hung in the air, mixing with the distant thump of music from somewhere deeper in the mall. Emma pressed close to Nick's leg, overwhelmed by the noise, the movement, the sheer volume of humanity surrounding them. She was small for her age, with her mother's dark hair and her father's quiet watchfulness. She also had her mother's heart condition, the one that required medication costing $412 a month, the one that made every fever, every shortness of breath, every moment of unusual fatigue feel like a countdown to catastrophe. Nick had learned to live with that fear the way he had learned to live with everything else. You carried it. You kept moving. You made sure your daughter got her chicken nuggets on Saturday. They reached the front of the line. Nick ordered, paid with cash from the envelope in his back pocket marked Emma's fun money, and guided his daughter toward an empty table near the center of the food court. She climbed into her seat, swinging her legs, already reaching for the toy that came with her meal. Nick sat across from her, his back to the wall, facing the open expanse of the court. It was an old habit, one he didn't think about anymore. He just did it, always had, always would. For a few minutes, everything was normal. Emma showed him the toy, a small plastic figure from some movie he hadn't seen, and explained its elaborate backstory with the serious intensity of a child who believed completely in the world she created. Nick listened, asked questions, watched her face light up with the simple joy of being heard. This was what mattered. This was what he had chosen. Then he noticed the security guard. The man stood near the entrance to the food court, maybe 40 feet away, his hand resting on his radio. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking above it, scanning the upper levels, the skylights, the architecture. His radio was silent. No crackle, no chatter. Just his hand resting on it, ready. Nick's gaze drifted to another guard, this one near the opposite entrance. Same posture, same upward focus, same silent radio. A third guard appeared near the fountain, positioning himself with studied casualness. His eyes swept the food court, paused on Nick, held for a beat too long, then moved on. Nick felt something cold settle in his chest. It was a feeling he hadn't felt in years, a sensation that belonged to a different life, a different man. Situational awareness, the recognition that something was wrong before the something made itself known. He looked down at Emma. She was dipping a nugget in ketchup, oblivious, happy, safe in the bubble of childhood that Nick had built around her with every choice he had made for the past 8 years. He looked up again. A janitorial cart had appeared near one of the exits, blocking the path with the yellow caution cones. A closed for cleaning sign had materialized near another. The two guards by the entrances had shifted slightly, angling their bodies in ways that would slow anyone trying to leave quickly. Nick's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen. No signal, not low signal, no signal at all. In the middle of a suburban mall, on a Saturday afternoon, he put the phone away, kept his face neutral, took a sip of the coffee he had ordered. The coffee was burnt and bitter, but he barely tasted it. His mind was running calculations he thought he had forgotten how to make. Exits, angles, timing, distance to Emma, distance to the nearest cover, weight of the table. Could he flip it if he needed to? How fast could he move her? Where would he move her to? None of it made sense. He was a mechanic. He fixed cars. He picked his daughter up from school at 3:15 every day. He paid his bills, bought his groceries, lived his quiet life in his quiet town. There was no reason for security guards to box him in. There was no reason for his phone to lose signal. There was no reason for any of this. But the feeling in his chest didn't care about reasons. It only cared about patterns, and the pattern was wrong. Emma looked up from her meal, a nugget halfway to her mouth. Her eyes had gone serious, watchful, and Nick realized with a pang that she had inherited more than his quiet nature. She had inherited his instincts. "Daddy," she said softly, "why are those men looking at us?" Nick forced a smile. "They're not looking at us, sweetheart. They're just doing their jobs." Emma studied his face with the penetrating clarity of a child who had learned to read adults out of necessity. Her mother had died when she was 3. She had grown up with a father who sometimes went quiet for no reason, who sometimes stared at nothing, who sometimes held her too tight when he said goodnight. She knew when something was wrong. She always knew. "Are we in trouble?" she asked. "No, baby." Nick reached across the table, took her small hand in his rough one. "We're not in trouble. We're just having lunch, okay?" Emma nodded slowly, but she didn't look away from his face. Nick held her gaze, poured every ounce of calm he possessed into the expression, willed her to believe him even though he wasn't sure he believed himself. Then he heard it. A sound, distant, high, a tearing whisper at the edge of perception. Not thunder, not a plane passing over. Something else, something with direction and purpose. Someone at a nearby table looked up, squinting at the skylights. A teenager pointed. A mother pulled her child closer without knowing why. Nick looked up. Through the glass panels of the mall's ceiling, he saw them. 2 shapes, small at first, then larger, moving with a speed and precision that made his blood run cold. F-16, fighting falcons, 2 of them, flying low, flying in formation, flying directly toward the mall. They weren't passing over, they were aligned with it. Their angle of approach was wrong for a flyover, wrong for a training exercise, wrong for anything except a weapons run. Nick had seen that angle before. He had seen it from the ground, from the air, from the cockpit displays of aircraft that no longer officially existed. He knew what it meant. He knew what came next. "Daddy." Emma's voice was small, frightened. "Daddy, what are those planes doing?" Nick stood up slowly, keeping his movements calm, keeping his voice steady. He took Emma's hand, lifted her from the chair, pulled her close to his side. "We need to go, sweetheart. Now." He turned toward the nearest exit. The security guard was there, blocking the path, his hand still on his silent radio. "Sir," the guard said. His voice was polite, rehearsed. "I need you to stay right here, please." Nick stopped. His arm tightened around Emma. The guard's eyes flicked down to the child, then back to Nick. "Just for a few minutes, sir. There's a situation we need to resolve." "What situation?" Nick asked. "I'm not at liberty to say." The guard's expression was blank, professional, but something moved behind his eyes, something that looked like fear. "Just please stay where you are." Nick looked at the other exits, guards at each one, the janitorial cart, the cleaning signs, the silent radios, the circling jets. He understood now. This wasn't random. This wasn't a coincidence. This was containment. He just didn't know why. "Daddy!" Emma pressed against his leg, her small body trembling. "Daddy, I'm scared." Nick knelt down, bringing his face level with hers. He cupped her cheeks in his rough hands, looked into her eyes, spoke with a calm he did not feel. "Listen to me, baby. I need you to be brave." "Can you do that?" Emma nodded, her lower lip quivering. "Good girl." Nick pulled her into a hug, held her tight, felt her small heart beating against his chest. "Whatever happens, you stay with me. You hold my hand. You don't let go. Okay? I won't let go, Daddy. I promise." Nick stood, keeping Emma's hand firmly in his. He looked at the guard, at the skylights, at the jets that were now holding a pattern directly above the mall. Visible, deliberate, a message, but a message to whom? He thought about running. He thought about fighting. He thought about all the things he used to know how to do, all the skills that lived in his muscles and his memory, dormant but not dead. But Emma was here. Emma was holding his hand. Emma was 7 years old and weighed 52 pounds and had a heart that sometimes skipped beats when she was frightened. He couldn't run. He couldn't fight. He could only wait. And so he waited. The food court had gone quiet. People had noticed the jets, noticed the guards, noticed the strange tension that had descended over the space like a fog. Some were filming with their phones. Some were huddled together, whispering. Some were frozen, caught between curiosity and fear. Nick stood in the center of it all, his daughter pressed against his side, his eyes tracking every movement, every angle, every possibility. The guards watched him with a wariness that made no sense. They were afraid of him. He could see it in the way they held themselves, the way they kept their distance, the way their hands hovered near weapons they clearly hoped they wouldn't have to use. But why? He was nobody. He was a mechanic who made $18 an hour and drove a rusted truck and had never been more than 50 miles from this town in 8 years. He was nobody. But the guards didn't act like he was nobody. They acted like he was something else entirely. Minutes passed. 5, 10. The jets adjusted their pattern, coming closer, their engines a constant pressure against the sky. Nick could feel the vibrations through the floor, through his bones. Emma whimpered, pressed her face against his leg. The guard nearest to Nick received a transmission. Nick couldn't hear the words, but he saw the man's face change. The professional blankness cracked. Something like relief flooded through, mixed with confusion, mixed with what might have been disappointment. The guard pressed his earpiece, listened, nodded once. Then he looked at Nick with an expression that was almost apologetic. "Stand down," the guard said into his radio. "Pull him out. Now." Above the mall, the jets banked hard. Their engines screamed as they veered away, climbing fast, disappearing into the gray afternoon sky. The pressure in the food court lifted. People began to move, to breathe, to talk in hushed and urgent tones about what they had just witnessed. Nick stood still, his hand wrapped around Emma's, his heart pounding with a fear he hadn't felt in years. Emma looked up at him. "Daddy," she said. "What just happened?" Nick didn't answer. He didn't know, but he was about to find out. The guards approached him now, their postures changed. The wariness was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like deference. "Sir," one of them said, "would you come with us, please?" Nick's instincts screamed at him to refuse, to demand answers, to protect his daughter from whatever this was. But the jets were gone. The tension had broken, and something in the guard's voice told him that the danger, whatever it had been, had passed. "Where?" Nick asked. "Somewhere private. There's someone who needs to speak with you." Nick looked down at Emma. She looked back at him, trusting, frightened, waiting for him to make it right. "Okay," Nick said, "but my daughter stays with me." "Of course, sir." The guard's voice was gentle now, almost kind. She was never in any danger, not really. Nick didn't believe him, but he followed anyway, Emma's hand tight in his, walking through the back corridors of the mall toward a truth he had spent 8 years trying to bury. The corridor was long and institutional, far from the gleaming storefronts and cheerful chaos of the public mall. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The walls were bare concrete, interrupted only by service doors marked with codes and warnings. Emma walked beside Nick in silence, her small hand gripping his with desperate intensity. The guards led them to a door at the end of the hall, unmarked, unremarkable. One of them knocked twice, then stepped aside. The door opened. Behind it stood a man. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair cropped close to his skull and eyes that had seen things most people couldn't imagine. He wore civilian clothes, dark slacks, and a gray jacket, but there was nothing civilian about his posture. He held himself with the coiled stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where the wrong word could end nations. He looked at Nick for a long moment, then his gaze dropped to Emma, and something in his expression softened. "She looks like her mother," he said quietly. Nick's blood went cold. "How do you know what her mother looked like?" The man stepped aside, gestured for them to enter. "There's a lot I know, Mr. Moore. Or should I say Chief Warrant Officer Moore, call sign Wraith." Nick didn't move. That name belonged to a dead man, a man who had died in a classified file 8 years ago, buried under layers of redaction and need-to-know protocols. A man who had walked away from everything he was because his wife was sick, because his daughter was born, because he couldn't be both things at once, and he had chosen to be a father. The man in the doorway seemed to understand. "I know you left," he said. "I know why. And I know you've spent 8 years building a life that has nothing to do with who you used to be." He paused. "But the past has a way of finding us, Chief, even when we're not looking for it." "Who are you?" Nick asked. "My name is David Ashford. I'm the deputy director of an organization that doesn't officially exist, and I'm the one who called off the jets." Emma looked up at Nick, confusion and fear in her eyes. "Daddy, who is this man? Why does he know your name?" Nick knelt down, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "This is someone Daddy used to work with, a long time ago, before you were born." He looked at Ashford, his jaw tight. "My daughter doesn't need to hear this. She doesn't need to be here. You're right." Ashford stepped aside, revealing a small room beyond the door. There was a couch, a table with juice boxes and crackers, a television playing cartoons. "There's a woman inside. Her name is Sarah. She's been with our organization for 20 years and she has 3 grandchildren of her own. Your daughter will be safe with her while we talk." Nick hesitated. Everything in him rebelled against letting Emma out of his sight, even for a moment. But Emma was looking at the TV, at the juice boxes, at the promise of normalcy in a day that had gone terribly wrong. "It's okay, Daddy," she said softly. "I'll wait for you." Nick pulled her into a fierce hug, pressed his lips to the top of her head. "I'll be right outside," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." "I know." Her voice was small but certain. "You never do." Nick released her, watched her walk into the room, watched the woman named Sarah smile at her with genuine warmth. Then the door closed and Nick was alone with David Ashford and the ghosts of the man he used to be. They walked to another room, this one bare except for 2 chairs and a table. Ashford sat in one chair, gestured for Nick to take the other. Nick remained standing. "Start talking," he said. Ashford nodded, as if he had expected nothing less. 8 years ago, you were the best combat helicopter pilot in the inventory. Night missions, low-altitude insertions, extractions that should have been impossible. You flew 47 classified missions across 4 theaters of operation. Your call sign was Legend. Nick said nothing. Your last mission was in a location I can't name, extracting assets I can't identify. Something went wrong. Your bird took fire. You lost your co-pilot and your crew chief. You got the rest out anyway. Flew damaged, bleeding, with one engine failing and another on fire. You put that aircraft down in a place that shouldn't have been survivable and walked away with 6 people who would have died without you. Nick's hands curled into fists. He could still hear the alarms, still smell the smoke, still see the faces of the men who didn't make it. You were offered the Medal of Honor. You turned it down. You were offered promotion, transfer, your choice of assignment. You turned it all down. Your wife had been diagnosed with cancer. Your daughter was 3 months old. And you walked away from everything because you couldn't do both. Ashford's voice was quiet, respectful. You chose to be a father. There's no dishonor in that. Then why am I here? Nick demanded. Why were there jets over my daughter's head? Why were guards treating me like I was a target? Because today you weren't the target. Ashford leaned forward, his eyes intent. You were what we call a variable, a factor that complicated an operation already in progress. Nick waited. 3 hours ago, we identified a high-value target in this city, Someone we've been hunting for years. Someone who was responsible for the deaths of 37 American service members, including 4 members of your old unit. Nick felt the floor shift beneath him. He knew those names. He had spoken at their funerals, held their families, promised to never forget. He had never forgotten. We tracked him to this mall, Ashford continued. He was meeting a contact in the food court. We had assets in position. We had authorization for a kinetic solution. And then you walked in with your daughter and sat down 30 feet from the target. Nick understood now. The guards, the jets, the containment. They weren't trying to capture him. They were trying to decide whether they could complete their mission with him in the blast radius. The jets, Nick said slowly. They were on a strike run. They were ready. We had targeting data. We had authorization. Ashford's voice was flat, clinical, and then I looked at the surveillance feed and saw a 7-year-old girl eating chicken nuggets with her father. A father who had given everything for this country and asked for nothing in return. Nick's throat was tight. He couldn't speak. I made a decision, Ashford said. I called abort. I pulled you out. The target escaped. He's gone and we may never find him again. And I would make the same call 1,000 times over. Why? Nick managed. Because we don't burn our own. Ashford stood, walked to the window that looked out on nothing but concrete wall. Because that little girl deserves to have her father come home. Because the men and women who serve this country aren't just numbers on a board, and neither are their families. He turned back to Nick. And because 8 years ago, you saved my son. Nick blinked. Your son, Captain Thomas Ashford. He was one of the 6 people on that bird. The one you carried out on your back when his legs were too shattered to walk. He's a father now himself. 2 kids. He teaches history at a high school in Virginia. Nick remembered. A young officer, barely 25, who had cried without shame as Nick dragged him through the wreckage. Who had gripped Nick's arm and made him promise to keep going even when Nick wanted to stop. Who had named his first child Nicholas. My son is alive because of you, Ashford said. His children exist because of you. And today I chose to believe that your daughter's life is worth more than one dead terrorist. Nick sat down heavily in the chair. His legs wouldn't hold him anymore. The target, he said. He's really gone. For now. Ashford returned to his seat. We'll find him again. It might take months. It might take years. But we'll find him. Nick looked at his hands. The hands of a mechanic, the hands of a pilot, the hands of a father. I can't go back, he said quietly. I know, I'm not asking you to. Nick looked up. Then what are you asking? For you to understand. Ashford's voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. What happened today shouldn't have happened. You shouldn't have been in that mall at that moment. It was chance, bad luck, the universe deciding to complicate our lives. But now that it's happened, I wanted you to know why. Nick was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Emma. Was she ever in danger? Ashford met his eyes. The order was for precision strike, minimum collateral. Your daughter was outside the projected radius. Nick's hands shook. Projected radius. She's 7 years old. I know, and I'm sorry. Ashford's composure cracked for just a moment, revealing the exhausted human beneath the deputy director. I have grandchildren. I know what you're feeling, but I also know that we stopped it. We made the call, and she's safe. Nick stood up. His movements were slow, deliberate, controlled. I need to see my daughter, of course. Nick walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the handle. Mr. Ashford. Yes, thank you for making the call. Ashford nodded. Thank you for everything you did when you were one of us, and for choosing to be a father when you didn't have to be. Nick opened the door and walked out. He found Emma in the small room, curled up on the couch with a juice box, watching cartoons with the intensity of a child who had decided that normalcy was the only acceptable option. She looked up when he entered, and her face lit up with relief. Daddy. He crossed the room in 3 strides, gathered her into his arms, held her so tight that she squeaked in protest. Daddy, you're squishing me. Sorry, baby. He loosened his grip but didn't let go. Sorry, I just needed to hold you for a minute. Emma studied his face with her two old eyes. Are we okay now? Yeah. His voice was rough. Yeah, we're okay now. Can we still get food? We didn't finish our chicken nuggets. Nick laughed. It came out broken, wet, but it was still a laugh. Yeah, sweetheart. We can still get food, but maybe somewhere else, okay? Okay. She wrapped her arms around his neck. Daddy? Yeah, baby? Those men were scared of you. I saw it. I know. Why? Nick held her close, breathed in the scent of her shampoo, felt her heartbeat against his chest. Because a long time ago, Daddy had a different job. A job where I helped people who were in trouble. I'm not a hero, he added quickly. I'm just a guy who knew how to fly helicopters. A little bit of quiet. Then Emma said, I think you're a hero. He closed his eyes against the tears that threatened to fall. Thanks, baby. I think you're pretty brave too. We can be brave together. Yeah. His voice was barely a whisper. We can be brave together. They left the mall through a back entrance, escorted by guards who treated them with a deference that Nick found almost painful. His truck was waiting in a service lot, keys in the ignition, as if it had been moved there specifically for them. Probably had been. He loaded Emma into her booster seat, checked her buckles 3 times, then climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The familiar rattle and cough of the old Ford was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. They drove to a different restaurant, a small diner on the edge of town where Nick knew the owner and Emma could get pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse. They sat in a booth by the window and Emma ate with the enthusiasm of a child who had decided that the scary part of the day was over. Nick drank coffee and watched her, memorizing every detail of her face, every gesture, every smile. He had almost lost her. Not through negligence or accident, but through the cold calculus of national security. She had almost become collateral damage in a war she didn't know existed, and a stranger had saved her. A stranger who owed Nick a debt he had never asked to be repaid. The world was strange and cruel and sometimes beautiful in ways that made no sense. All you could do was hold on to the people who mattered and hope that was enough. Daddy, Emma said through a mouthful of pancake. Yeah, sweetheart. Can we go to the park after this? Nick smiled. It was a real smile, the first one he had managed all day. Yeah, baby. We can go to the park. They went to the park. Emma played on the swings while Nick sat on a bench and watched the sky. No jets, no helicopters, just clouds drifting across the blue, indifferent to the dramas unfolding beneath them. His phone buzzed in his pocket, signal restored. He pulled it out, found a text from an unknown number. It contained only 3 words. Thank you, Wraith. Nick deleted the message, put the phone away, and went to push his daughter on the swings. That night, after dinner and bath time and the elaborate ritual of bedtime that Emma insisted upon, Nick sat in the living room of their small apartment and looked at the photograph on the mantel. It showed a woman with dark hair and a smile that could light up a room. She held a newborn baby, tiny and wrinkled and perfect. Nick stood beside her, younger, leaner, wearing a flight suit with patches he had been ordered to never discuss. That was the last photograph taken before the diagnosis, before the treatments, before the long decline and the moment when Nick had held her hand and felt the last breath leave her body. She had made him promise to take care of Emma. She had made him promise to be there. She had made him promise to choose life over duty, love over honor, presence over glory. He had kept that promise for 8 years. He would keep it for the rest of his life. From Emma's room, he heard a small voice. Daddy? He went to her, found her sitting up in bed, her nightlight casting soft shadows across her face. What's wrong, sweetheart? Can't sleep? Emma shook her head. I keep thinking about those planes. Nick sat on the edge of her bed, took her hand in his. I know, that was scary, but it's over now. We're safe. Emma was quiet for a moment, then she said, Daddy, were you ever in a plane like that? Nick hesitated. The truth was complicated. The truth was classified. The truth was something he had sworn to never tell. But Emma was looking at him with her mother's eyes, and she had been brave today. Braver than anyone should have to be at 7 years old. She deserved something that resembled honesty. I used to fly helicopters, he said carefully, for the Army, a long time ago. Did you help people? Nick nodded. I tried to. Sometimes I did, sometimes I couldn't. Emma considered this with the seriousness of a child working through a difficult problem. Is that why the man at the mall knew your name? Because you used to help people? Something like that. Emma squeezed his hand. I'm glad you helped people, Daddy. And I'm glad you came home. Nick's throat tightened. He leaned forward, pressed a kiss to her forehead. Me too, baby. Me too. He tucked her in, smoothed the blankets, made sure her nightlight was on and her stuffed rabbit was within reach. At the door, he paused. Emma? Yeah, Daddy? I love you. More than anything in the world. You know that, right? Emma smiled, already drifting toward sleep. I know, Daddy. I love you too. He closed the door softly and walked back to the living room. Through the window, he could see the stars coming out, bright and distant and utterly indifferent to the struggles of the humans beneath them. He had chosen this life, the small apartment, the steady job, the daughter who needed him every single day. He had walked away from medals and missions and the heady rush of being someone who mattered on a global scale. He had chosen to matter to one person instead. Some days he wondered if he had made the right choice. Today was not one of those days. He went to bed, slept deeply for the first time in years, and woke to the sound of his daughter singing in the kitchen, making breakfast for a father she had decided was a hero whether he believed it or not. He let her believe. It was easier than explaining that heroes didn't let their people die, that heroes didn't walk away, that heroes didn't spend 8 years fixing cars and pretending the past didn't exist. But maybe that wasn't quite right either. Maybe heroes were just people who showed up, who kept their promises, who chose love over glory, presence over achievement, ordinary days over extraordinary missions. Maybe heroism wasn't about the things you did when the world was watching. Maybe it was about the things you did when no one was watching at all. Nick walked into the kitchen, accepted the slightly burnt toast his daughter had made, and told her it was the best breakfast he had ever had. She beamed at him with her mother's smile, and he knew with absolute certainty that he had made the right choice. Sometimes we look at people and see only what they show us, the worn clothes, the calloused hands, the jobs that don't sound impressive at dinner parties. We make assumptions based on surfaces and move on, never knowing what lies beneath. But beneath every ordinary exterior, there might be an extraordinary story, a sacrifice no one witnessed, a choice that changed everything, a past that can never be fully left behind, no matter how hard we try. Nick Moore was a mechanic who made $18 an hour and drove a rusty truck and picked his daughter up from school at 3:15 every single day. He was also a man who had flown into fire, who had carried wounded friends to safety, who had made choices in cockpits that most people would never understand. He had been both things. He would always be both things. The only question was which one he chose to be on any given day. He chose to be a father, every morning, every evening, every moment that mattered. And in the end, perhaps that was the most heroic thing of all. Not the missions that made history, not the medals that gathered dust, just the simple sacred act of being there, of showing up, of loving someone so completely that you would walk away from everything else just to watch them grow. Emma would never fully understand what her father had done, what he had sacrificed, what he had been before she was born. But she would know that he was there. She would know that he came home. She would know that she was loved. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Subscribe if you believe that real heroes don't need recognition. They just need someone to come home to. Comment the word wraith if you think Nick Moore deserves his peace. And remember, the next time you look at someone and think you know their story, you probably don't. Everyone has a battle they're fighting. Everyone has a choice they're making. Everyone has a reason to be brave. Sometimes the bravest thing of all is simply choosing to be present in the lives of the people who need us most.